Hi, this is going to be a talk about getting started with Android. I'm Kevin Galligan. Well, you should listen to me. I learned to code when I was 7, and I'm way older than 7 now. I've been doing Android since 2008, which they actually had before the phones came out, and Java basically forever. I am president of Touch Lab. We're an Android consulting company. We're going to have 8 apps featured this year, which I didn't know until last week, and somebody I didn't realize. We run the big meetup in New York for Android. We just ran Android Con, so I know something about Android. I guess that's my intro. Okay, this is what Android is. I didn't know exactly where to start, so I'm starting super, super basic and expand out. It's obviously a mobile OS. I mean, it's just basically a flavor of Linux. With some UI frameworks thrown on top and different modules that make it obviously usable for a mobile environment, but also usable for TVs now. You can use it for the wearable stuff. We'll see how that pans out. It runs glass. You apparently can put it in a car, although I don't know if that's actually going to happen. Stuff like that. People are making desktops with it. I don't know if I'd recommend that, but you can. And then I guess that's it. So Android is that. It's an OS with a bunch of services on top. It's fun, but can be fairly complicated, mostly because of the rate of change in the environment. So I'm going to start with parts of an app. This is sort of, the assumptions here are you know Java and you can code in Java. If you can't, you're going to have a pretty hard time with Android. So you should start there, assuming you can code in Java. Every application is made up of an application package, which is distributed to the phones or whatever you're working with. Inside there, the most critical thing is the manifest. I don't know if you can just have a manifest and nothing else. That'd be an interesting thing to try. The manifest tells the system what is in your app. And the basic building blocks is an activity. An activity is like the most important thing you need to understand in Android. It's the thing that you can show stuff with on the screen. And inside the activity is UI. It's roughly equivalent to a window, but don't get too caught up with that. There's an intent. An intent is how you communicate between your screens and your app, between your app and the system, between services, across processes, everything. Get very comfortable with what an intent is. It's essentially a message that can be persisted. So you put a bunch of data in there, and then if the phone goes to sleep and wakes up, and it still has it. Long story short, I won't get too into it. Blah, blah, blah. Then there's a service, which is the thing that runs in the background. We're not going to talk about that at all today because we don't have time. There's a broadcast receiver, which passes messages back and forth between the system and your app and inside your app and yada, yada, yada. Don't have time for that. There's content provider, which lets you look at data across process boundaries. So you can go in and query contacts on the phone. You can query a bunch of other stuff. Content providers are useful for that. There's a side note, which is people recommend you write content providers for all your data. I would not recommend that, but like many things in Android, there is a lot of disagreement in the community, so I've had plenty of pretty serious arguments about that. So do whatever you feel like. Then there's a fragment. I put it in quotes because a fragment is like a modular representation of what an activity is kind of doing. The idea that came about when there were tablets coming out. So Google decided that you can have one application and then have the UI broken up. So they kind of coded a fragment to have the same life cycle as an activity, but be modular. So that sounds great, but it also is really complicated and way beyond the scope of today. So we're not going to talk about that. And I don't always use them anyway. So there you go. Also, that's a little bit of heresy, as with the content providers. Not all that much agreement out there on that. So building screens. To make a basic screen, you create an activity, you create essentially your view, and you create your XML view definition, and then you register it with your application and put it in your manifest. Do we actually, if I just bring up code, we'll be able to see that?
Yeah,
cool.
I have to increase font size a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let me do this really quick while I talk. See if I can do 2 things at once. So you create your activity. Activity is going to extend the activity class, oddly enough. Oops, what are we doing here? Okay, and
Perfect.
then you register that with, so here we go, activity, and you create extends activity. Seems pretty straightforward. Why did you do that? And then in your manifest, you just put it in there and you define this. Again, I can't get into too much detail because it's going to take forever. But you put this in here, and then there's some little extra stuff in here that tells it that it's going to be the thing that starts when you load your application, right? So that's how you do it. The XML layout, just to give you a feel for it, is you have a layout container, you got an image view, you got a button, you got a text view, you got a button. There's just components you put in there, and they get rendered on the screen when you actually run the application. So to give you a preview, starting earlier before we're actually getting there in the demo. Hold on a second. Okay, so you hit play. Here you go. Does some magic stuff like load image, and that'll go out to the network and do something. And then you can load text from the network, and that'll show it. Although that's a bug, and I didn't finish that in time. Maybe we'll fix that during the demo. Okay, that's basically it. You create an activity, you create a view, and you put your view in the activities window, and then you interact with it by doing things that are probably beyond the scope of this talk. So, okay, what is an activity? Core screen component, lifecycle overview, which is a note to me, not really what it is, but just to point that out there. Lifecycle overview, basically, the activity has, it's one of the most obnoxious things in Android, and you're going to have to get really used to it, is the Android lifecycle, activity lifecycle. You just have to get used to this chart. I mean, it shows up as a thing, as a search result, because that's how much people get freaked out by it. It's complicated, and it all has to do with the fact that the system has to maintain this thing when it's running, when it's in the background, when a call comes in, it can run in the memory, it has to shut it down, but it has to keep replaced. This isn't even close to the actual full set of methods in there. What you need to know is on create and on destroy is when the thing is birthed and actually completely killed. On start, on stop, kind of not so much. On resume and on pause is when it's actually running and when it's not. And if you learn those things, that's great. And then the rest of it you'll have to learn at some point. But anyway, but just remember that. I mean, you'll forget it, but then remember it later when you see it. Okay, so yeah, I kind of already explained this. You just set the content view, you put up triggers listening to button clicks, whatever you're going to do, and then that's how you interact with your app. The view hierarchy, all the windows, everything that you see that isn't completely custom coded by you is built with this view hierarchy, and they all extend the base class view. That includes, buttons, text lists, scroll views, everything extends view. Everything that is done with everything that's laid out with the XML files that you saw briefly, and we'll go back to in a second, is a view group, which is basically a parent container. So you should get used to linear layout and relative layout. Even though I don't really like relative layout, I would say just start with linear, but you're going to see relative all over the place. Again, a lot of disagreement on that, but relative's complicated. That's why I don't like it. So you have to make sure you understand it. Linear is very simple. It's just put it vertically, put it horizontally, that kind of thing. Just so, yeah, parent, everything inside there is a view. Again, with our code, you can see linear layout, orientation is vertical, and then we have an image view and a button and a text view and a button. That's basically it. It gets obviously significantly more complicated than that. That's it. So there are other things that you should get very familiar with because you're going to need them. Collection views, like list view, but that's way, list view, but that's way beyond discussion for today. And then everything, all buttons basically have on click. So if you're kind of messing around and hacking and learning, you basically get this, we have this go button, which points to this, and you have an on click, and then you can do stuff. So for this example, here's our activity on create. Again, this is when the activity gets birthed. You have to call super on create. It'll blow up if you don't, so don't worry about it. You'll know it. Set content view sets that XML, which actually under the hood inflates that whole thing into actual components. Find view by ID is how you find stuff. Got the go button set on click, and then that loads image. Load image gets the image view, which is that guy, and then just loads it with Picasso, which is one of the wonderful libraries I'll put links to, and you should find out about. Anyway, I think that's about as well as I can explain the UI. Where are we time-wise?
We're about 10 minutes in.
What's that?
10 minutes in.
Okay, cool. So, quick discussion, just wanted to throw this out there. You can do code-based view creation. You can do your whole thing in code. And sometimes developers are really code preference heavy. I wouldn't do that. All the tools are very much based on the XML definitions. So I've dealt with a lot of different people, a lot of new developers over the years. Sometimes they're just going to do whatever they want to do, but it's going to be a much harder road and definitely less readable. But just throwing that out there. But you will occasionally need to do pretty heavy, like code-based view manipulation. So you should learn it, but I wouldn't start there. Okay. So I feel like doing our big survey of Android, there's no way to get into mobile. The hardest thing to learn about mobile, if you are coming from any other background, I think is threading, which gets also the least attention. So I just wanted to explain this as best I can in the time. Threading is critical to Android. It's critical to all mobile too, like same thing on iOS. And if you don't really understand what's happening, you're gonna have a really, really bad problem. In web, there really is no multi-threading. I know that if you look at like Ajax calls, it's a way of thinking that it's multi-threading, but it's not really, because there's no point at which you're managing state outside of a single thread context. So when you're on the client, you make a call, that goes to the server. The server usually is one thread context, and you're not managing state there, even though there's multiple threads running, but you're just doing one, and it comes back. And even though it's asynchronous, it's still like not two things happening at the same time, except for web workers, but nobody uses them. So yeah, you need to understand this, and it's something that people underestimate how bad you can make things. If we had a whole day, I would go through my rules for how to do threading, but we don't. So so anyway, most standard Android, there's one big thread that runs throughout the entire system. It's not quite that simple, but as far as you're concerned, it is. There's one thread called the main thread, often called the UI thread. That's because everything that happens in Android, including the UI, happens in that thread. Everything that's long running needs to happen in a different thread. Long running being defined by longer than 5 seconds, or your system will get a pop-up that says your app's not responding. But don't think like, okay, if I only take 4 seconds in the main thread, I'm cool. Like, you shouldn't take anywhere near that because your app is not responding while it's happening. So the basic rules are: don't read and write disk data on the main thread. There are some subtle exceptions you can make to that, but basically don't do that. Don't do network calls in the main thread, and you can't anymore. You used to be able to, I think, gingerbread and below. Just don't. And then don't touch the UI from a background thread, and a lot of other things. You can't, if you're loading data from disk, it would be much easier to just say, hey, I want to push this into a text view from that context, but you totally can't. And actually, I can't get into it, but like, I have a long explanation of why there's a main thread and the design of a system and like why you need that, but like, again, that's going to take all day. So you can't do that, but don't worry, you'll know because your app will blow up. So that's the basics of threading. I'm going to have some libraries that will be coming along in our test project that you can download if you want to play with it, with some examples of that, but they're super basic. It's just something you're going to have to read into. There's no shortcut to avoiding that, I think. Okay, the state of Android. It's interesting. If you're an iOS developer, there's like Xcode, and then there are libraries that Apple has, and then there's definitely some stuff out there, but it seems like there's a general consensus of what you should do. Android is not like that at all. One of the guys I linked into here, Mark Murphy, has a great book that he continually maintains, and he's a great member of the community. He kind of told me privately about a year ago, he's like, he's getting out of training for a little while because there are now two different IDEs and two completely different like schools of thought, and then a ton of APIs and a new version coming out and all this stuff. And he's like, training now is actually hard because there's like it's kind of all over the place. So there are two IDEs. There was Eclipse that Google had standardized on, and all of their examples were for Eclipse. And then a vocal minority used IntelliJ, but it didn't matter. There was this old project structure that the folders were laid out a certain way, yada yada. And now we have Android Studio, which is just about to get into the first 1.0 version release with a completely different build system and a completely different folder structure. So you're in a state of some projects are the old thing, some projects are the new thing, some examples of the old thing, some of the new thing. Some people refuse to leave Eclipse vocally, very vocally refuse to leave Eclipse. Half of Android like standard examples are old, half are new. So you have to be aware of that. I'm making it sound more dire than it is, but then again, I'm thinking if you've never seen this stuff, it probably is kind of freaky. I've been doing this for a very long time, so I'm totally used to it. Many different libraries and many different opinions about which ones you should use. So if I told you our best practice stack, and I will in a minute, you'll find people who like very vocally disagree with that. So you're going to kind of have to make your own decision.
Okay, you are, go over that part just a second.
Okay, not sure we dropped, but your stack.
5 seconds ago.
Okay, so we're gonna give you a stack today. Gotta get Android Studio. We have a link in there. Download Android Studio. I think it has an SDK packaged in the download, but basically follow the instructions. They can tell you how to start that. Those instructions are pretty good. Prepare for Google's documentation to be inconsistent. So just throwing that out there. Studio they got. Some of the other stuff is a little bit whatever. You're going to need something to run your project on. The standard Android emulator has been terrible, has always been terrible. It's still terrible. So if you don't have, we usually develop directly on devices. So you plug in with USB, push the application there. I developed my personal phone for better or worse. There is something called Genymotion, which uses something called VirtualBox to have a really fast emulator, which is good, but Google doesn't let them put Google stuff on there, so you need to like sideload it. I'll leave that up to you. Then Square outside of Google is like the shop. So Square, the credit card thing. There are two things that they have a bunch of stuff. But we're going to talk about Picasso, and which is an image loading library, which we're starting to use for pretty much everything now, and Retrofit, which is a networking library, which we're also mostly using everywhere. Then there's something called Green Robot, which has an event bus, which if you don't really understand threading at a deep level, it's kind of hard to explain why you need that. But essentially, when you do stuff in the background, you need to throw it back over the threading wall to the main thread, and Event Bus makes that very easy. There are like 20 different ways of doing it. You're going to use this one. I don't know what else to tell you. And then I have this thing called Magic Threads. I have a really bad habit of coming up with projects and giving them stupid names and regretting it later. But it's a very serious project that is the culmination of several years of refinement of doing background threading tests, and then also we have to extend Event Bus because it doesn't handle errors well, and all this other kind of stuff. So that's your stack today that's in our test project. What do we got here? All the links are here, but you're probably going to post them somewhere, so I don't know. But I did local hack day, Android, Bitly. Figured that was easy to remember. Okay, so resources that you should. So that is the default Android ringer, and if you work in a room full of Android developers, it gets confusing. Mark Murphy Commonsware, again, that was the guy I mentioned before. He has a 426,000 score on Stack Overflow. if you see an answer on there, he's probably right. If you give an answer and he tells you you're wrong, you're probably wrong. I'm just going to tell you that right now. He writes a book that he continually updates. You can subscribe to it. It's like $40 a year. It's like 2,000 something pages now. You don't want to read the whole thing, obviously, but that's the thing to read. It's awesome. There's a standard Android training, which will walk you through the basics. You know, you'll see the activity, you'll see the life cycle. Again, you know, if it tells you to build a content provider, I would ignore it, but you know, I've had arguments with Google engineers about that. And Stack Overflow, of course, if you're not very familiar with navigating Stack Overflow, you should get familiar immediately. I'd also recommend getting very familiar with GitHub if you're not very familiar with that, because there's tons of stuff out there. And just start getting into the community and doing stuff. So let's see. Okay, so the demo, again, you have to download Android Studio, and then I have this, the project up on GitHub, so you can go grab it. So that's the thing I just showed you. I want to see if there's anything else I can tell you about it. So yeah, I'll just actually walk through what it does. So there's two things that this does. It downloads an image, which you saw there. Let me refresh that so we can get that to be, you can see it actually happen. It's two buttons. They do two different things. One downloads an image and one loads some text. So the load image one, which we kind of walked through before, so here's the two buttons, go button, go text. We should probably rename this to be consistent to go image. And then Studio does a really good job of refactoring stuff in your XML and everywhere else. So it did that fairly well. Anyway, load image, what that does is it gets the image component, and then we use here Picasso. That was the thing I mentioned. Picasso does a really, really, really good job of intelligently loading images from the network. And that's been traditionally a very big problem on Android. You could either use Picasso or Volley, which is Google's thing. If you have another one that you want to use, I would understand very clearly why you want to use something else, because we've kind of used all of them, and this is the only one we use right now. All you do is, for this, the simple way to do this is just give it a URL of an image, and that's what we did. So you click it, and then it loads it, and then voila, it's all done. Fantastic. The other one is load text. Load text will give you an example of our threading thing. So the Magic Threads thing has a thing called task queue. Task queue is a serial background task processing and management engine. So you can add a task to this queue by doing this and calling execute. Each task extends task. They have a run method. And then we have this thing called handle error. I'm very big on explicitly handling errors, and you should be too, because if you're not, you're going to have really bad apps. This means it returns false, which means I didn't handle it. So if this actually has some kind of crash, the app will blow up, which is a good thing, because then you'll know what's wrong. And then onComplete just does this thing where that event bus thing I talked about, it posts it to here. So on this is right now in a different thread context in the background. So when you get back to your activity, you can get the message from that task you just ran in this special thing from the event bus. And then you can put the text into the text view that's on the screen. So you'll see here, we do that, but I have a little bug because I called toString on something, which really doesn't make sense. I'll see if I can fix that in like 2 seconds. And I can't because it's an input stream and that's going to take too long. So assume that had some text and we put it into the text string, which it did, but it's just a name of a class. So that's why it's a bug. We could do that, but I won't get into it. So you can see if you're going to do anything, if you want to use the base, you can use this project to start a really basic app. I don't know what you're going to try to do with the hacking today, but you'll see in here the dependencies. So we've got Picasso, retrofit, and all the basic stuff that I was talking about in the stack. I can talk more about that, but I think we'll just kind of wrap up what we were going to present here. So,
questions too.
Oh, you do? Okay, let me see. Oh yeah, so by the way, if you're going to use that project, install Studio and then just do File, Open that folder where you got from the GitHub, and then there's a Gradle sync button. This little thing here, you hit this, you probably can't see it, but it's sync project with Gradle, and then like that should do everything, and you can like click play. It used to be significantly more work to like open and load a project. Studio's doing a good job of that, but you have to like not try to do anything exotic. Like don't try to import the project. Don't try to like do all this crazy stuff. It's interesting. It takes a little while to get used to, but it actually works really well. I don't even know what I have left here. Oh, okay. Other example projects besides my like extremely minimal one is basically there's an SDK folder, that exists, the samples folder. Again, you have to be very careful. You have to look for the Gradle project structure if you're using Studio, which basically means look for build.gradle in the root. If you see RES and assets and all these other folders in there, that means it's the old project structure, and Android Studio is going to not like it. I mean, you can get it to work, but it's going to be kind of a pain. And if you happen to have Lollipop and you like doing a lot of crazy video stuff, this is another thing. We just gave a presentation at a meetup, so I kind of included that there. I think that's kind of it. So you have a question, and I can go into any detail you want.
So the first question is each task handled by a separate thread? I think this is related to what you were talking about with tasks.
No.
You might want to repeat the question too.
Okay, is each task handled by a separate thread? It's not. The way that task queue works is everything processes in serial. Under the hood, it actually uses an executor service, but it's a single thread. There are problems with doing everything in a serial fashion, but you can get into a lot of trouble if you try to do a lot of parallel processes. So that was sort of an architecture decision. We tend to have a fair number of people working on projects that then get handed off to a client who may not be super fantastic on Android. So I lean towards less complex, more likely not to crash. And then if you have performance problems, you sort of deal with them on a case by case.
Cool. This is going to be a hairy question. Why would you use Android Studio over Eclipse? And do you have to stick to one or the other?
Okay, that's a multi-part question. What's that? Okay, why would you use Eclipse over Android? Or why would you use Android Studio over Eclipse? And what was the second part?
And like, if you pick one, do you have to stick to it? Like, is it hard to switch?
Okay, so there's a personal bias here. I've been using IntelliJ forever. I actually, not to age myself, but it doesn't matter, I'm old. I've been using IntelliJ since version 3. They're up to version 14 right now. I've used Eclipse for a long period of time in between there, thinking that Eclipse was open source and it was going to win. We actually started writing plugins for Eclipse, all this kind of stuff. IntelliJ earmuffs to everybody who loves Eclipse. IntelliJ is just better. So you should learn that, and Android Studio is based on IntelliJ. Even from the beginning of Android, I would use IntelliJ and then maybe just flip over to Eclipse to compile the project. At Google I/O 2013, they announced that Android Studio is going to be based on IntelliJ. So if you're going to learn one, learn Studio. Like if you learn Eclipse, it's getting like rolled out of the way, so you're going to learn something you have to unlearn eventually anyway. If you're an Eclipse fan, some people recommend starting on Eclipse now with Android. I wouldn't, but again, if I've learned anything, it's that people have a difference of opinion, a different opinion than I do sometimes. So you can do that. If you're learning one, do Studio. Don't even download Eclipse. You'll be out of your mind.
One last question, which I'm trying to find here.
I've got one in the meantime.
Yeah,
so where can people go for like Android help? Like say you're at a hackathon and you get stuck and like, there's nobody around who knows Android. Where are like some of the best online resources to go to get help with Android?
I mean, the only one I ever really use is Stack Overflow. And Stack Overflow is like, it's all there. It's just finding it. You know what I mean? The problem is if you're at a hackathon, obviously there's a time component. So if you have something that's unique, it will be difficult to get an answer. But if you're doing something that you're new at Android and you have a unique question about Android that's not on Stack Overflow, you're probably doing it wrong. Like, I mean, it's just not possible, right? So it's there. It's just, being judicious about picking out what's probably the good answer versus whatever, but that's the point. So yeah. That's the only one. We don't use anything. There's no like, I can't even think right now. Like we don't, I rarely use Google's Docs. Like we just kind of go to Stack Overflow and cross your fingers. It's either that or like actually digging through the open source code, which is nice that it's there because, you know, I've done a lot of stuff where you run a debugger and you actually step into Android's underlying source code and figure out like, oh, okay, that's what it's doing. Because again, Google's Docs are like not great.
Right.
The last question here is, I guess this is a little confusing to me. Where do I get the emulator?
Okay, I actually can walk through that. So if you install Studio,
Well, wait, repeat the question.
okay, where do you get the emulator? You have to install Studio. They have a pretty easy explanation of how to do that. Once you get Studio actually up and running, which means you gotta have Java. I don't know if you're running Linux or Windows or what you got. Mac's got Java, blah, blah, blah. Like that, you're gonna have to sort out. But once you get there, you have to install the SDKs. I would pick, you know, maybe Android L 5.0, definitely like KitKat 442, whatever. That includes the platform, and then also I think all the stuff you need for the emulator. Then you go into tools, and there is the Android device monitor. And nope, that's the wrong one. It's a long night last night, sort of. ABD manager. That's what you need. So ABD manager is the Android virtual device manager, and in here you just create a new one and you give it a name, ASDF, and you pick a target. I have a ton of them installed. You would have less if you just installed a couple platforms. And then you just have to fill all the stuff out. Intel x86 runs faster, but sometimes I've had trouble with that. But you should try that first. It is extremely slow. It's been extremely slow since it started. It hasn't gotten any faster that I can tell. Some people disagree with that. We almost never use the emulator, but if you don't have a device, you obviously kind of have to. That's it. So there. Now I'll hit play, and there's no way you'll see this actually start before I'm done, because it just takes hours. Not hours, but it'll take like several long minutes because it's running a fully emulated version of Linux in a non-optimized emulator. That's why like Genymotion is good, because it uses VirtualBox, which is like a real emulator.